All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're going to tackle a really tough question. What happens when our political principles seem to collide with our political loyalties? We're going to break down a pretty provocative argument about how the way we talk about foreign policy, using Iran as a case study, might just reveal something, well, kind of inconsistent about our public conversations.
So think about this for a second. Imagine there's a danger that pretty much everyone agrees is a real, serious problem. Now, what if one day, the way we talk about that danger completely changes? Not because the threat itself is any different, but because the person dealing with it is.
So just to be clear, our goal here is to simply unpack the argument from the source material, piece by piece. We're not taking sides, we're just going to lay out the claims and the logic being presented, so you can see exactly how the case is built and, make up your own mind.
Okay, so let's start with the central contradiction that this whole analysis is really built around.
The source material kicks things off by setting the stage. For decades, it seemed like leaders from both sides of the aisle spoke about Iran in a really similar way. They warned about its nuclear program, its aggression in the region. The language was consistently strong. It felt like a shared understanding of a very real threat.
And this is where the source says things get weird. When President Trump took a very direct, confrontational stance against that exact same threat, the whole focus of the public conversation seemed to pivot. All of a sudden, it wasn't just about Iran anymore. The conversation became intensely focused on Trump himself.
And that leads us to the real mystery the analysis wants to solve. Did the facts on the ground actually change? Did Iran suddenly become less of a threat? Or did the emotional and political script we were all reading from get a major rewrite?
So let's dig into that first major piece of the argument. It really questions whether the reactions we saw were based on consistent principles or on the personality of who was in the White House.
This right here highlights the core contrast the source points to. So, while the threat from Iran was the constant, the description of the American response seemed to change completely. What was once talked about as a necessary action against a grave danger was suddenly being framed as an issue of President Trump's personal recklessness and his temperament. The focus, the argument goes, shifted from the what to the who.
The source uses this quote from Douglas Murray to really hammer this point home. The idea is that the true test of a principle is whether you stick to it even when it's politically awkward, especially if it means agreeing with someone you can't stand. If your so-called principle only shows up when it helps your team, is it really a principle? Or is it just, decoration?
So what's going on in our heads when this happens? Well, this next quote offers a kind of psychological explanation. Gad Saad's point is that for a lot of us, the main goal isn't always logical consistency. It's about feeling like we belong to our political tribe. So if the tribe's position changes, our position changes with it, because that emotional loyalty can be a way more powerful force than some abstract principle.
Okay, so if our reactions are being driven more by tribal loyalty than by principle, how does that actually work? The source argues that this isn't just something that happens by accident. It's an active reframing of who we're supposed to see as the bad guy.
Think about it. In any conflict, there's a story being told, right? And every good story needs a clear villain. The source claims that the narrative around the Iran conflict was deliberately re-engineered to swap out who we saw in that villain role.
The source basically breaks this process down into 4 steps. Step 1, a real external threat is there. Step 2, a leader who is really disliked by a big chunk of the media and the political world decides to confront that threat. Step 3, the public conversation immediately shifts away from the threat and onto that leader's personality and their motives. And the final step? The original danger just kind of gets lost in the noise of this new domestic drama.
So why does this happen? Well, the source points to this explanation from Glenn Greenwald. Our media world thrives on personality and conflict. A complicated foreign policy issue is a tough sell, but a story about a controversial, recognizable face like Donald Trump, that's a magnet for clicks and outrage. It's not just ideology, it's a business model.
And the end result of all this reframing, according to the source, is that a serious international problem gets turned into what the commentator Victor Davis Hanson calls a domestic psychodrama. The whole debate stops being about national security policy and instead becomes about our collective feelings about one guy. The original problem? It gets buried.
This brings us to the core engine that the source claims allows these double standards to exist and even feel normal, the battle over the story itself.
This table really lays out the 2 different ways of looking at an event according to the source. On one side, you can judge the policy. That's based on facts, the goal is to be clear, and you'd expect consistency.
But on the other side, you can judge the narrative, and that's all about framing, the goal is tribal loyalty, and the result, well, it's often contradiction. The argument is that our public debate is more and more happening in that second column.
To take that a step further, the source uses this quote from Glenn Greenwald to argue that the media isn't just a passive mirror reflecting what we think, it's an active engine shaping it. By choosing what to focus on, which emotions to play on, and how to frame the story, the exact same event can be delivered in two totally different emotional packages, leading to two totally different public reactions.
The source actually gives this whole phenomenon a name: narrative preemption. It's the idea that before we even get a chance to process the facts for ourselves, a prepackaged story, complete with heroes, villains, and a moral of the story, is pushed on us. This kind of preemptive framing makes it incredibly hard to make an independent judgment.
So, if we're constantly being fed these prepackaged narratives, what are we supposed to do about it? Well, the source material ends not with a final judgment on other people, but with a challenge for us, and it offers a few tools to help us push back.
Here are the practical steps the source suggests for trying to resist this stuff. First, compare the rhetoric. How does what someone is saying today line up with what they said 5 or 10 years ago about the same issue? Second, check your own gut reaction. Is it based on the facts, or is it just a partisan reflex? Third, be a little suspicious of that rush of certainty you feel, especially when it fits perfectly with your side. And finally, just reclaim the simple habit of comparison. Look for when the outrage seems, lopsided.
And this really gets to the heart of the whole thing. The argument isn't just about pointing fingers at politicians or the media. It's about turning the lens back on ourselves. The real test isn't just being good at spotting hypocrisy in our opponents. It's having the honesty to spot it and fight it in our own thinking.
So, we end up right back where we started, with a question. And it's a question the source leaves not for pundits, but for each of us to answer for ourselves. Is our standard for judging things fixed and solid? Or does it bend and change depending on who happens to be in charge? It's a tough question, for sure, but in a world this polarized, it might be one of the most important ones we can ask. Thanks for tuning in.